Yes, 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 sir.
You know, I'm convinced that even if I didn't have an address,
Come on now.
Come on.
no
Be
that
thankful. Come
Put
on.
it out there. That's baby.
Come on.
still got to be thankful.
Thankful. Yes, God. Yes, God.
I know a man,
Come on.
I know a young man
Say it.
that taught me
Come on now.
what it is really to be
Come on,
grateful.
come on, come on.
Yes.
Humble that,
Sometimes
humble
you just
that.
got to meet somebody
Right. Right.
that meet those criterias that don't have an address.
Come on now.
Ain't got no running water. Ain't got no electric.
And thankful.
Don't know where the next meal's coming from, but walking around thanking God.
Come on.
Anyhow.
Come on now.
Get it.
Oh, hallelujah.
Come on, Pastor.
Sometimes we complain because we can't get that burger the way we want it.
Your way.
Well, today I'm going to talk to you about Thanksgiving. Seeing how we're in that week of Thanksgiving, I thought we'd talk about the origins of Thanksgiving, the origins of Thanksgiving in America, and just how that all came about. And does Thanksgiving actually meet a biblical kind of holiday?
Yes, sir.
We talk about Christmas and Christmas not being a biblical holiday. We talk about the way that we practice Easter is definitely not biblical, and so it's more. Both of those are more pagan in nature. But we're going to take a look at Easter and see if Easter is biblical or not. I don't know if when Samira was no, it wasn't Samira wasn't reading the scripture. Who? Andrew was reading the scripture. If you guys caught in there as she was reading Leviticus, how at this Feast of Tabernacle, how it's a 7-day feast.
Yes, sir.
And so they are feasting before the Lord. They're celebrating before the Lord for 7 straight days. You gotta get that 7 straight days. We struggle with 7 straight minutes. But they did it for 7 straight days. And here's the thing that I really like about the scripture that just kind of stood out to me as we were talking about helping and giving and all that stuff. And I was talking about begging and all that. And the Lord had set up in this particular Feast of Tabernacle, or they call it Feast of Booths, or they call it Feast of Ingathering as well. And as you go through the scripture, you'll see it termed differently, but it's the same feast. But that he set it up, and he said on the first day it was going to be a holy convocation, it would be like a Sabbath day. And then on the 8th day it would be like a holy convocation, which is a Sabbath day, which would mean that there would be no work on those days. And then in the midst of that, he said, in addition to that, you're going to have your normal Sabbath day, which is a day of rest too. So there's 3 days of rest in there that you can do nothing but offer up to God the sacrifices. But the thing that I really like about it is that there were sacrifices that they had to do each day of the 7 days that they gave unto the Lord, and that they sacrificed unto the Lord. And the free will offering and all those things still had to be given, so they didn't get to take away because they were in this particular feast. That feast just encompassed more things that they had to give too. So they had to give additionally for this particular feast. And it's one of the 3 major feasts. This feast, the Feast of Passover and the Feast of Pentecost, are 3 major feasts that actually men were instructed that they had to take their sons to Jerusalem to celebrate these feasts. And so these were, I like to think of these as the Feast of the Men, you know, that God had set up, and God had set this up that you take your sons to Jerusalem on these 3 major feasts. There's 7 major feast days, but on these 3 major ones, we want you to take them to Jerusalem. Well, we see in this feast also that they were giving, and then on the last day, I mean, I don't know if you caught it in there. I think it was in verse 39, caught it in there where it says, and there's going to be a great celebration, a great rejoicing. Yeah, you see that in there? It says that in this thing, we need some rejoicing. And so this feast was all about celebrating. It was all about God bringing Israel out of Egypt. And when they were in the wilderness for 40 days, or for 40 years, that they lived in booths, or these shelters that they created out of the materials that you read in the text. And so they would sleep in these booths, they would eat in these booths as a part of this celebration for 7 days, so they wouldn't sleep in their homes. Well, history says that when they created the booths, that they would leave the roof kind of with holes in it, so that when they were sleeping they could look up in the heaven And it was a reminder to them that they were just sojourning through the earth, that this was not their place, that they were waiting for heaven. They were waiting for the architect and the foundation of heaven, so that they knew that that's where they were going to be. So it was a reminder to them that God brought them out of Egypt, but that they were on their way to the promised land, but God had something even greater for them, and that greater was heaven. And so the booth would be like that. Well, if you go down through Bexley, during this celebration was in their sacred months, it would have been the 7th month. In their civil, according to their civil calendar, it would have been the 1st month. But it would have been the month of Tishra. And that month of Tishra runs somewhere between September and October. And so I think in some Bibles, if you look at some of the translations, it actually will say, it'll actually have in parentheses, October. So this was a feast or a festival that took place in Octoberish, late Octoberish maybe. And this is what Israel was to do. Okay, this is what God told them to do. And so we see that he's instructing Moses to tell the children of Israel, this is what I need you to do in celebration of me bringing you out of Egypt. And so the thing about this particular feast is that it fell at the end of the harvest season. So at the time of this feast, they would have been going into the rainy season. Okay. And so it was also a celebration of not just God bringing them out of Egypt, but it was also a celebration of God giving them good harvest from the previous year. And it was a celebration also they went into because they knew it was going to be raining and they were going to start the plowing season. It was also for God to let it rain, to make the land moist. And so there was a lot going on in this celebration, and that's why they were so jubilant about the celebration, is because they're celebrating God bringing them out of Egypt, and then they're celebrating God giving them provision through the crops growing, all the various crops that would grow. So this particular celebration is at the very end of the harvest, and that's why they called it ingathering. So it was a season of ingathering. Well, that's synonymous also to when we look at Jesus Christ and his second coming, the ingathering. Yes. And so the Feast of Tabernacle really speaks about Jesus, and hopefully before the day is out, we'll get to that. But it speaks about Jesus. Okay, Jesus actually showed up for the Feast of Tabernacle. We'll look at that in St. John's, the 7th chapter, that Jesus during the Feast of Tabernacle was actually there, and he declared to the people that were celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles some of the elements in the feast that they were doing. He declared unto him that it was him that they were celebrating. Okay. Okay, so they were looking for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Okay, they were looking for the light of the world. So two elements in the celebration was that on the 8th day, at the conclusion of the celebration, the priest would go down to the pool of Shalom. He would take a golden pot. He would dip it in the pool of Shalom. He would take that pot and go into the temple and go to the altar and pour that water out on the altar, signifying that they were looking for God not only to pour out rain on the land so that the crops could grow, but they were also looking for God to pour out his Spirit upon man. Come on. And so there was a great celebration about that. The second element in there that they would do is that they would light torches. And so the whole city of Jerusalem would be lit up with torches from thousands of people with these torches crowding the temple area. And the streets, they said, you could just see the lights everywhere, and the whole city would be lit up. And they would have these torches, and Jesus spoke to that too, because he realized they had the torches on that last day, and there were these lights, and these lights was symbolic of them waiting for the light of the world. And so Jesus stood up in the midst of them and said, I am the light of the world, the light that gives life to man. So in the midst of the feast, Jesus declares the elements in which they're doing that. I'm that person. I'm what you're looking for. Well, how does this all fit into Thanksgiving? Okay. All right. How does this fit into Thanksgiving? So if we back it up a little bit and go to 1621 in American history, we find out we know about the Mayflower, right? And so we know that these people that came in on the Mayflower came from England, right? I'm not very good with history, so if I mess up some dates and stuff, then just bear with me. So they came on the Mayflower to Plymouth, right? Which was New England, right? But we know that there were some casualties, and they met up with some Indians. And that the people who came actually didn't know much about farming, definitely didn't know how to fish. So they didn't know nothing about no fishing, nothing like that. But the reason that they came was like 100 people that came. And the reason that they came is because they were having a problem in England. And the problem that they were having in England was that, that the Parliament wasn't totally subscribing to purifying the Christian religion. The Parliament was still kind of hanging in there with Catholicism. And so the Puritans and the Pilgrims were a little upset about that, and they wanted the Parliament to actually lock in and let's get away from Catholicism, because part of their problem was, while they were in England, part of the things that they were struggling with was, one, that there was too much Catholicism going on. So in Catholicism they had, like, if I remember the numbers right, they had like 25 religious holidays. And then they had 27 of biblical celebrations they did. And the people were getting a little overwhelmed with that. And because of that, they were like, okay, this is too much. This is not even biblical. Thank you, sir. And the other problem they were having is that not only do we have all these holidays that we're celebrating, not only have you contaminated and not given the truth of the gospel, but you also are celebrating Christmas. Yeah, so they had a problem with Christmas over in England. The Pilgrims and the Puritans was having a real problem with that, because they understood that that day was not a biblical day. And so they knew that that day was brought in by Catholicism. And so they were trying to get away from that and get things back to the way that the Bible talked about and get back to being pure. Okay. And so, so they were having trouble with that. Not only were they having trouble with that particular holiday, but they was having trouble with Easter as well. Okay. Because Easter doesn't show up in the Bible the way that Catholicism was putting it out there. And so they were struggling with these two things. And so they decided that, this group of people decided that they would leave. And so they got on the Mayflower. Yes, sir. Oh, just the Catholicism, if you could explain that for those who don't know. Catholicism is just Catholic, the Catholic Church. There you go. Yeah, it's just the Catholic Church and the rituals that's embedded in the Catholic Church. And so this is what they were struggling with, and this is why these people got on the Mayflower to come to what we call the New World, right? And they found themselves in New England, which is now Massachusetts. And so they landed there. But if you know the history, I think it was 1621, maybe it was 1620, that they had to go back on the ship because the weather was so bad, and even the journey over was a really tough journey across the waters. But they had a really rough winter, and they were unable to come off the ships. And because they were unable to come off the ships to live in the land, there was a disease that hit the ship. And so they lost half of the passengers. So half of the 100 died, and there were only 50 left, right? Okay. And so after that season passed, they met up with the indigenous people of the land, the Indians of the land, and then the Indians began to show them how to plant crops. Now this is before folk decide they're going to slaughter the Indians, right? The Indians is helping them, and then after that, they slaughter them, right? But so the Indians began to show them how to plant crops, things like corn, and they began to plant crops. They showed them how to actually hunt for eel and fish and all that. So they began to learn some things, and they showed them how to actually prepare meals out of these various things that they were teaching them about. And so they were able to plant a crop, and then in 1621, the crop was plentiful, and so the Native Americans got together with these pilgrims, and they had a celebration. Now we have Thanksgiving, which is a one-day celebration, but and I want to preface, because we used to think history tells us, in school don't tell us everything that we should know about that, but we tend to think that was, some of our history says that was the first Thanksgiving in America. that was the first Thanksgiving. But there are other documents that validate that there was Thanksgiving going on even way before that. Other documents says that just about every religion celebrated a Thanksgiving. Just about every religion celebrated a Thanksgiving, and just about in every religion, the Thanksgiving was based off of thanking their God. Okay, and so as they got together and going to have this big 3-day meal and this 3-day celebration, and Thanksgiving was always just about in everywhere I looked, and just about every religion, every document says that Thanksgiving was always a religious holiday. No matter where you look, it was always a religious holiday, and it was a religious holiday that was filled with prayer, fasting, and gratitude to God. And so the meal for Thanksgiving is unknown. They're not sure history-wise what they really ate. We know what we eat. We eat some turkey and some chitlins and some ham and, some greens and all of that stuff. That wasn't part of their thing. But nevertheless, theirs was inundated with the fact that they wanted to thank God. Because God got them through that rough winter, and then God supplied them with a good harvest, a good crop. And so they were celebrating the goodness of God, and they were doing it with the Native Americans that had helped them through that time. Okay? It didn't actually become a holiday. I believe it was, I want to say, which president was it? Roosevelt? No, Roosevelt, it was before Roosevelt that it actually got instituted as a national holiday, and it was being celebrated. And it was always being celebrated on the 4th Tuesday of the month of December. And it was Roosevelt during the Depression that thought that he could turn it into maybe a money-making thing. And that because we were in the Depression, that he would do something that would actually maybe, conjure up some money. And so what he wanted to do was, he wanted to move it back a week. He wanted to have it in the 3rd week of the month instead of the 4th week of the month, which was the traditional week. He got a lot of pushback on that. A lot of pushback. People were not happy. And it wasn't so much that they weren't happy with the fact that he wanted to make it the 3rd week. They were unhappy because he was making it a money thing. And so I'm trying to think if history says he was able to do it for 1 year, and then he flipped it back to the 4th week. They flipped it back because there was so much pushback on that. And then there was one president, and I think Calvin, maybe, if history serves me right, that wasn't really into God like that. And so this whole celebration of thanking God for what God had done for the country, for war, getting us through wars and all that stuff, he wasn't with that. And so he actually suspended celebrating Thanksgiving as a holiday for a while. And then when his term was over, then it picked up again. So our history shows that the celebration of Thanksgiving actually had a hiccup in it to where we didn't do it for a while, and then all of a sudden we were doing it again. But it was because of a president who said that he didn't want to do that. And so this day, this Thanksgiving Day, which we're going to find out a little bit more about. So these Pilgrims and Puritans, the Puritans actually didn't hit the land until about 1630, I believe it was, when they really just had enough over in England. But the Pilgrims who came and they were Christians, and they knew. And so when they came, what they were actually instituting and what they actually started on Thanksgiving, this first Thanksgiving that they had, was actually the Feast of Tabernacle. They took it straight from the Bible, because they were celebrating the fact that God had given them a good harvest. And they were also praying for God to give them good rain for the following season. And so they were thankful for a couple of things. Some history shows, and I've never seen it in our history books, but some of the history says that they were thankful for the crops that God gave them, and they were thankful for the Indians. And so they were thankful for their new friends, and they were thankful for the crops. And then they were praying and celebrating that God would allow the heavens to open up so that they would have plenty of rain. Okay, so And so Thanksgiving, as we know it, actually, the history says came from the Feast of Tabernacle. Okay? That celebration, again, being a feast that's celebrated at the end of the harvest season and being grateful to God for what God had done in terms of giving a good harvest throughout the year. And so the people would lose their mind. Okay? The people would lose their mind. So I'm going to fast forward to the New Testament and just look at Jesus. You know, I always like to think if it's a holiday that God is happy with, I ought to see Jesus somewhere in it. You know, every holiday that God actually instituted, and one day we're going to go through this. Each minister is going to have an opportunity to minister on one of the feasts of God. I just think it's just a wonderful thing because in each feast you see Jesus. In each feast you see Jesus. The Feast of Tabernacle, God says, I will come and tabernacle with you. The Feast of Tabernacle symbolizes Jesus' second coming. That he's coming to his people. Revelations talk about that. And so the Feast of Tabernacle talks about Jesus. It talks about the ingathering of the people and Jesus coming back. And so this is why the people would sit in the booths and look and just look at, okay, he's coming. God's got another thing for us. Okay. We're just sojourning through this place. And so, again, if you were to go down into Bexley and look in some of the backyards, even on some of the front yards during the Feast of Tabernacles, you would see that they have constructed booths because they still celebrate the Feast of Tabernacle. Okay? Not